There is a strange kind of noise that forms when your life begins to move in a direction others cannot keep up with. And what makes it even more unusual is that this noise does not come from your actions directly. It comes from the reactions your actions create in people who are watching from a distance. Because while you are focused on your own path, building quietly, improving steadily, staying consistent in ways that feel natural to you, something entirely different is happening behind the scenes. Something you did not plan, something you did not initiate, and yet it is unfolding with intensity. Because your presence has become a point of comparison for people who never intended to measure themselves against you. And now that they are realizing gaps they cannot ignore, differences they cannot explain, and progress they cannot match at the same pace. And this is where the tension begins to build. Not outwardly at first, but internally, within them. Because the more they observe you, the more they are forced to confront parts of themselves they have been avoiding. And that confrontation is uncomfortable. It creates pressure. It creates a sense of imbalance. And instead of processing that discomfort inwardly, many begin to project it outwardly, turning what should have been personal reflection into external reaction. And this is how the energy around you starts to shift. Because what was once quiet observation becomes discussion. What was once discussion becomes comparison. And what was once comparison begins to turn into conflict. Not necessarily with you, but among themselves. Because now they are not only trying to understand you, they are trying to position themselves in relation to you. And this positioning creates friction. Because when multiple people are competing within the same unspoken framework, without clarity, without alignment, without self-awareness, it leads to tension that cannot remain hidden for long. And this is why, even though you may feel like you are simply minding your own business, simply doing what feels right for your growth, there is a completely different dynamic unfolding around your name. One where people are arguing, defending their own positions, challenging each other, and revealing insecurities they would have otherwise kept hidden. And the most important thing for you to understand in this moment is that none of this was created by your intention to compete. It was created by your decision to align, because alignment naturally exposes misalignment. Consistency naturally highlights inconsistency, and clarity naturally reveals confusion. And when those contrasts become too visible to ignore, reactions are inevitable. But those reactions are not yours to carry. They are reflections of what others are facing within themselves. And this is where your awareness becomes essential. Because the more you understand this dynamic, the less you will be tempted to step into it, to respond to it, or to let it influence how you move. And instead, you will recognize it for what it truly is. Not a disruption to your path, but confirmation that you are no longer operating on the same level of awareness as those who are still caught in cycles of comparison and reaction. And as you continue moving forward without making noise about it, without announcing your progress or demanding attention, something begins to unfold in a way that feels almost paradoxical. Because the quieter you become about your growth, the louder its impact becomes on those who are observing you. And this is where the realization starts to deepen. That your growth has not just elevated you, it has begun to disturb the internal balance of people who are still operating within patterns you have already outgrown. Because what you are doing now is not just about achieving more, it is about moving differently, thinking differently, responding differently. And this difference, while subtle to you, is deeply visible to those who have been watching you over time. Because they remember who you were. They remember how you used to move, how you used to react, how you used to operate within limits that now no longer seem to apply to you. And this contrast becomes impossible for them to ignore, because it challenges the consistency of their own identity. It raises questions they are not prepared to answer. And this is where your growth begins to act as a trigger. Not because you are trying to provoke anything, but because your evolution has created a gap, a visible distance between where you are now and where they still remain. And that gap carries a kind of pressure, a silent reminder that change is possible, that improvement is real, that discipline leads somewhere. And while this realization can be inspiring for some, for others it becomes uncomfortable, because it disrupts the narratives they have been telling themselves, the excuses they have been holding on to, the belief systems that allowed them to remain where they are without feeling the need to move. And now, with your presence reflecting something different, those narratives begin to weaken. Those excuses begin to feel less convincing. And this is where the internal tension begins to rise, because they are faced with a choice they did not expect to confront. Either they acknowledge the possibility of change and take responsibility for their own growth, or they resist that possibility and find ways to justify why your path does not apply to them. And this is where the trigger becomes active, because instead of turning inward, many turn outward, projecting their discomfort onto you. Not directly at first, but through subtle shifts in behavior, in tone, in the way they speak about you, in the way they interpret your actions. Because when someone feels challenged by something they do not fully understand, they often attempt to reduce it, to label it, to bring it back into a framework that feels manageable. And this is where you may begin to notice small changes, conversations that carry an edge of comparison, comments that attempt to downplay what you are doing, interpretations that try to assign your progress to luck, timing, or external factors, rather than acknowledging the internal alignment that has brought you here. And this is not random. It is a response to the pressure your growth is creating, because the more consistent you become, the harder it is for them to maintain their previous understanding of you. And this is where the dynamic begins to shift more visibly. Because what started as internal discomfort begins to surface externally. Not necessarily as direct confrontation, but as subtle forms of resistance, as attempts to reframe your progress in a way that makes it less threatening to their current position. And this is where your awareness becomes essential, because it allows you to see these reactions not as personal attacks, but as reflections of internal conflict. Because what they are responding to is not you as a person, but what you represent. The possibility of change, the evidence of discipline, the demonstration that growth requires a level of commitment they may not be ready to give. And this is why it is so important for you to remain grounded in your own alignment. Because the moment you begin to internalize their reactions, the moment you start to question your movement based on how it is being perceived, you risk stepping back into the very patterns you have already moved beyond. And this is where your strength lies, not in proving anything to them, not in defending your progress, but in continuing to move forward with the same clarity that brought you here. Because your growth was never about comparison. It was never about being ahead or behind anyone else. It was about alignment, about becoming more aware, more intentional, more consistent in how you show up for your own life. And this is what makes your movement so powerful, because it is self-sustaining. It does not rely on external validation. It does not require recognition. It continues, regardless of how it is interpreted. And this is what ultimately creates that pressure in others, because they are used to environments where motivation is external, where progress is visible and acknowledged, where validation plays a role in sustaining effort. And when they see you operate without those dependencies, it challenges their understanding of how growth works. because it reveals a level of independence they may not have developed yet. And this is where the trigger deepens, because it is no longer just about what you are doing. It is about how you are doing it. The way you remain focused, the way you maintain consistency without needing constant reinforcement, the way you continue to evolve without making it a performance. And this is what creates that sense of discomfort that can eventually turn into reaction. Because when someone is confronted with a level of discipline or clarity they do not yet possess, it forces them to either rise to meet it or find ways to dismiss it. And not everyone is ready to rise. Not everyone is willing to confront the effort required to move forward. And this is where projection becomes easier than reflection, where comparison becomes easier than accountability. And this is why your growth becomes a trigger, not because it is aggressive or overwhelming, but because it is consistent, because it does not fluctuate, because it remains steady in a way that makes it difficult to ignore. And this consistency is what amplifies everything. Because over time, what might have been dismissed as a phase becomes recognized as a pattern. And patterns are harder to deny, harder to explain away. And this is where the reactions around you may begin to intensify. Because the longer your growth continues, the more it reinforces the contrast between your path and theirs. And this contrast is what creates the internal pressure that eventually spills outward. And this is where you must remain even more aware. Because as the reactions become more visible, the temptation to engage, to respond, to explain can increase. But this is where your discipline must extend beyond your actions into your awareness. Because not every reaction requires a response. Not every projection deserves your attention. And the more you understand the source of these reactions, the easier it becomes to remain detached from them. Because you recognize that they are not about you. They are about what your growth represents to those who are still navigating their own internal conflicts. And this understanding is what allows you to continue moving forward without interruption, without being pulled into dynamics that do not serve your path. Because your focus remains on alignment, on clarity, on continuing to evolve in a way that is true to you. And as you hold this position, you will find that the trigger you create in others does not diminish your progress. It confirms it, because it reflects the distance you have created between where you are now and where you once were. And that distance is not something to shrink, not something to explain away. It is something to continue expanding, because it is the natural result of your commitment to growth. And as you continue to move forward with this understanding, you will see that what once felt like external pressure becomes irrelevant, because your direction is no longer influenced by it. Your movement is no longer defined by it. And this is what allows you to remain consistent, to remain aligned, to continue evolving regardless of how others react. Because you are no longer moving for them. You are moving from you. And that is what makes all the difference. And as this dynamic continues to unfold, as your growth keeps moving forward without needing to declare itself, another layer begins to reveal itself in a way that is even more complex. Because what you start to realize is that the tension surrounding you is not simply about observation anymore. It has evolved into something far more subtle, yet far more intense. Something that you never consciously agreed to be part of. And that is the silent competition that others have placed you into. Because while you are moving with intention, focused on your own alignment, there are people around you who have begun to measure themselves against you without your participation, without your awareness. And this creates a dynamic that feels unbalanced from the very beginning. Because competition usually implies two sides actively engaging. But in this case, there is only one side competing while the other is simply continuing on their path. And this imbalance is what creates confusion. Because from your perspective, nothing has changed. You are still doing what you have been doing, still refining your process, still improving your mindset, still maintaining your consistency. But from their perspective, everything has changed, because now your presence has become a reference point, a standard they feel the need to reach, surpass, or at least explain. And this is where the silent competition begins to take shape, not through direct confrontation, but through internal comparison, through the way they observe your actions and then evaluate their own in relation to yours. And this evaluation is where the tension begins to build. Because comparison rarely leads to clarity when it is not grounded in awareness. It often leads to frustration, to self-doubt, to a sense of falling behind. And this is especially true when the person they are comparing themselves to is not operating from the same level of awareness, because they are trying to match your results without understanding your alignment. They are trying to replicate your outcomes without recognizing the internal shifts that made those outcomes possible. And this is where the gap becomes even more apparent. Because no matter how much they attempt to keep up externally, the internal misalignment continues to create resistance, continues to create inconsistency. And this inconsistency is what fuels the frustration, because they can see what you are achieving. They can observe the pattern of your progress, but they cannot fully access the process that is driving it. And this is where the competition begins to feel unfair in their perception, because they are measuring effort against outcome without accounting for alignment. And this creates a distorted view where your results seem disproportionate to your effort, where your movement appears smoother, more efficient, more direct. And this perception is what intensifies the pressure, because now they are not just comparing results, they are comparing the way those results are achieved. And when they cannot match that process, the frustration deepens, because it challenges their understanding of how progress is supposed to work. And this is where the emotional layer of competition begins to surface, because what started as comparison begins to carry emotional weight. It begins to affect how they see themselves, how they evaluate their own progress, how they interpret their own efforts. And this is where the internal dialogue begins to shift from observation to judgment, from curiosity to criticism. And this criticism is not always directed at you. It is often directed inward. But because it is uncomfortable, because it creates a sense of inadequacy, it eventually seeks an outlet. And this is where the projection begins to take form. Because instead of addressing the internal misalignment, it becomes easier to externalize the pressure, to question your methods, to doubt your process, to find explanations that reduce the gap between what they are doing and what you are achieving. And this is where the silent competition becomes more visible, because it starts to influence behavior. It starts to shape interactions. It starts to create subtle shifts in how people engage with you, in how they respond to your presence, in how they interpret your actions. And this is where your awareness becomes even more important, because you begin to recognize that you are being placed into a dynamic that you never agreed to, a dynamic that is not aligned with your intention. And this recognition is what allows you to remain detached from it, because you understand that engaging in that competition would require you to shift your focus outward, to measure yourself against others, to operate within a framework that is based on comparison rather than alignment. And this is exactly what you have moved beyond. And this is why it is so important to maintain your position, to continue moving in a way that is not influenced by how others are measuring you. Because the moment you step into that dynamic, the moment you begin to participate in that silent competition, you risk losing the clarity that allows you to move the way you do. And this is where your discipline must extend beyond your actions into your perception. Because it is not enough to stay consistent in what you do. You must also remain consistent in how you interpret what is happening around you. Because the more you understand that this competition is not yours, the easier it becomes to ignore it, to let it exist without letting it influence your movement. And this is what allows you to maintain your alignment even as the pressure around you increases. Because while others may be reacting to comparison, you are continuing to respond to your own awareness. And this difference is what keeps you grounded, what keeps you focused, what allows you to continue evolving without being pulled into cycles that do not serve your growth. And as you continue to hold this position, you will notice that the competition around you may intensify, not because you are engaging with it, but because your lack of participation makes it even more difficult for others to resolve their own internal tension. Because they are looking for a response, for a signal, for something that confirms the dynamic they have created. And when that response does not come, when you continue to move independently, it forces them to confront the reality that this competition exists only on their side. And this realization can be uncomfortable, because it removes the illusion of shared engagement. It reveals that the pressure they are feeling is self-generated. And this is where the dynamic begins to shift again. Because when someone realizes that they are competing with someone who is not competing with them, it creates a kind of internal imbalance that cannot be sustained for long without either deeper reflection or increased projection. And this is where you may see the reactions become more pronounced. Because the tension is no longer being balanced by the assumption of mutual engagement, it is being exposed as one-sided. And this exposure is what often leads to more visible reactions, more noticeable shifts in behavior, more direct forms of comparison, or even subtle attempts to provoke a response. And this is where your awareness must remain steady. Because the more visible the competition becomes, the more tempting it can be to acknowledge it, to address it, to engage with it in some way. But this is where your clarity must guide you. Because you understand that your path is not defined by how others measure themselves against you. It is defined by how you remain aligned with your own movement. And this is what ultimately allows you to move beyond the entire dynamic. Because while others are still navigating the tension of comparison, you are continuing to evolve from a place that is not influenced by it. And this is what creates that sense of distance, not as separation, but as elevation. Because you are no longer operating within the same framework. You are no longer engaging with the same metrics. You are moving in a way that is guided by awareness rather than comparison. And this is what allows you to continue progressing without being slowed down by dynamics that do not belong to you. Because you recognize them for what they are, not as challenges to overcome, but as reflections of where others are in their own journey. And this understanding is what keeps you grounded, what keeps you focused, what allows you to continue moving forward with clarity. Because you are no longer distracted by the idea of competition. You are aligned with the process of growth. And that is what ultimately sets you apart. And as this silent competition continues to build pressure within them, as the gap between your alignment and their internal state becomes more visible and more difficult for them to ignore, there comes a point where that pressure can no longer remain contained. Because comparison that is not resolved through awareness will eventually seek release. And this is where the emotional layer begins to intensify in a way that transforms the entire dynamic. Because what started as quiet observation, what then evolved into internal comparison, now begins to shift into something more reactive, more expressive, more outwardly visible. And this is where embarrassment enters the picture. Not as something openly admitted, but as something deeply felt. Because when someone realizes that they have been measuring themselves against you and cannot match the consistency, the clarity, or the results you are producing. It creates a kind of internal exposure, a feeling that their efforts, their image, or even their perceived position is no longer as stable as they once believed. And this realization can be difficult to process because it challenges identity. It challenges self-perception. It challenges the narratives they have built about who they are and what they are capable of. And when those narratives begin to crack, when they can no longer be maintained with the same level of confidence, embarrassment begins to surface. Not always in a conscious way, but in a subtle, internal recognition that something does not align, that something feels off, that something they believed about themselves is no longer holding up under the reality they are now facing. And this is where the emotional tension begins to build even further. Because embarrassment, when not acknowledged, does not simply disappear. It transforms. It seeks a direction. It looks for a way to release the discomfort it creates. And this is where aggression begins to take shape. Not necessarily as direct confrontation at first, but as shifts in tone, in behavior, in the way they engage with you or speak about you. Because when someone feels exposed internally, one of the most common responses is to redirect that exposure outward, to protect their sense of self by shifting the focus away from their own misalignment and on to something external. And in this case, you become that external point of focus, not because you have done anything wrong, but because your presence is what triggered the realization in the first place. And this is where the dynamic becomes more noticeable. Because the subtlety that once defined their reactions begins to fade, and more visible patterns begin to emerge. Patterns that reflect the internal conflict they are experiencing. Because now, their behavior is no longer just influenced by comparison. It is influenced by the need to protect their identity, to maintain their sense of self in the face of a reality that is challenging it. And this is where you may begin to notice changes that feel more direct, more intentional. Comments that carry a sharper edge, attitudes that feel more defensive, interactions that seem to carry an undercurrent of tension. And this is not random. It is the result of that internal pressure reaching a point where it can no longer remain hidden. And this is where your awareness becomes even more critical, because it allows you to see beyond the surface of these reactions, to understand that what you are witnessing is not about you personally. It is about the discomfort they are trying to manage, the embarrassment they are trying to avoid, the identity they are trying to protect. And this understanding is what prevents you from taking these reactions as something you need to respond to, because you recognize that engaging with them would only pull you into a dynamic that is not aligned with your movement. It would require you to step into their framework, to operate within their emotional state, to react rather than remain aligned. And this is exactly what you have moved beyond. And this is why your discipline must remain strong in this phase. Because the more visible their reactions become, the more tempting it can be to address them, to defend yourself, to correct misunderstandings. But this is where your clarity must guide you, because you understand that their reactions are not based on a misunderstanding of you. They are based on an internal conflict within themselves. And no amount of explanation from you will resolve that conflict, because it is not something that can be addressed externally. It requires internal reflection. And this is something only they can choose to engage with. And this is where your strength lies, in your ability to remain grounded, to continue moving forward without being pulled into the emotional current that is forming around you. Because while they are reacting from a place of discomfort, you are responding from a place of alignment. And this difference is what keeps you steady, what keeps you focused, what allows you to continue evolving even as the environment around you becomes more charged. And this is where the contrast between your path and theirs becomes even more pronounced. Because while they are navigating cycles of reaction, of projection, of emotional fluctuation, you are maintaining a level of consistency that is not influenced by those cycles. And this is what ultimately reinforces the gap, not just in results, but in awareness. Because your movement is no longer tied to external validation or comparison. It is rooted in a deeper understanding of how you operate, of what keeps you aligned, of what allows you to move forward without being disrupted by what others are experiencing. And this is what makes your presence so impactful. Because it is not just about what you achieve, it is about how you remain steady in the face of dynamics that would normally create distraction or hesitation. And this steadiness is what continues to challenge those around you, because it reveals a level of control, a level of clarity, a level of emotional discipline that they may not have developed yet. And this is where the cycle can either continue or begin to shift. Because for some, this exposure can become an opportunity for reflection, a moment where they begin to recognize the patterns they are operating within and choose to change them. But for others, the discomfort may lead to deeper projection, to stronger reactions, to more visible forms of aggression. And this is where your awareness must remain unwavering. Because regardless of how they respond, your path remains the same. Your alignment remains the same. Your movement remains guided by clarity rather than reaction. And this is what allows you to continue moving forward without interruption. Because you are no longer defined by the dynamics around you. You are defined by the way you remain aligned within them. And as you continue to hold this position, you will find that the intensity of their reactions, while noticeable, does not have the power to influence your direction, because you understand where it comes from. You understand what it represents. And most importantly, you understand that it is not yours to carry. It is not yours to fix. It is not yours to engage with. And this understanding is what keeps you free, what keeps you focused, what allows you to continue evolving without being pulled back into patterns that no longer belong to you. Because you are no longer reacting to the surface. You are seeing the deeper dynamics at play. And that awareness is what allows you to remain steady, to remain aligned, to continue moving forward regardless of what unfolds around you. And as this pressure continues to circulate among them, as the internal discomfort they feel begins to take on more visible forms, something even more revealing starts to happen. Something that shifts the entire dynamic from being about you to being about them. Because what once appeared as subtle comparison and quiet tension now begins to fracture their own connections, their own alliances, their own sense of stability within their circles. And this is where the situation evolves into something far more complex than simple observation or even projection. Because now they are no longer just reacting to you. They are reacting to each other in relation to you. And this is where the real conflict begins to surface. Because when multiple individuals are operating from a place of comparison, insecurity, and unprocessed pressure, they inevitably begin to clash. Not because they are intentionally trying to compete with each other, but because they are all attempting to position themselves in a way that restores their own sense of control, their own sense of identity, their own sense of being enough in the presence of what you represent. And this positioning is where tension multiplies, because it is no longer a one-dimensional comparison. It becomes a network of comparisons, a web of subtle competition, where each person is not only measuring themselves against you, but also against each other. And this creates an environment where stability cannot be maintained, because the reference point they are using is not grounded in their own alignment. It is based on an external measure that none of them fully understand or can consistently match. And this is where the cracks begin to show. Because when people are not aligned within themselves, their connections with others are often built on unstable foundations, on shared perceptions, on mutual validation, on unspoken agreements about identity and status. And when those foundations are challenged, when the reference point shifts, when someone like you introduces a level of alignment that disrupts their shared understanding, those connections begin to weaken. Because the agreements that once held them together are no longer as solid as they once appeared. And this is where you may begin to notice the shift. Not directly, not always in obvious ways, but through the energy that surrounds certain interactions, through the way conversations carry tension, through the way alliances seem less cohesive, through the way disagreements begin to surface where there was once agreement. And this is not coincidence. It is the natural outcome of internal misalignment being amplified within a group dynamic. Because when individuals are under pressure, when they are dealing with unresolved comparison and internal conflict, that energy does not remain contained. It influences how they interact with each other, how they interpret each other's actions, how they respond to situations that might have previously been neutral. And this is where the conflict begins to escalate. Because now the focus is no longer solely on you. It is on how each person relates to you in comparison to others. Who is closer? Who is further? Who understands? Who does not? Who is progressing? Who is falling behind? And these comparisons create divisions. They create subtle hierarchies. They create a sense of competition that extends beyond you and into their own relationships. And this is where arguments begin to form. Not always openly at first, but through tension, through disagreement, through the breakdown of communication. And as this continues, as the pressure remains unresolved, those subtle tensions can evolve into more direct forms of conflict. Because when people are unable to reconcile their internal discomfort, they often seek external outlets. And those outlets can manifest as disagreements, as blame, as attempts to assert dominance or control within their own circles. And this is where the phrase, "they are turning on each other," becomes a reality. Not in a dramatic or immediate sense, but in a gradual, progressive way, where the stability of their relationships begins to erode under the weight of the pressure they are experiencing. And this is where your awareness must deepen even further. Because while it may appear on the surface that these conflicts are somehow connected to you, you must understand that you are not the cause of these fractures. You are the catalyst that revealed them. Because the instability was already present. The misalignment was already there. The unresolved issues were already beneath the surface, and your presence simply brought them into visibility. It created a contrast that made those issues impossible to ignore. And this is why it is so important for you to remain detached from the unfolding of these dynamics. Because engaging with them, taking responsibility for them, or even attempting to mediate them, would pull you into a space that is not aligned with your path. It would require you to step into a level of involvement that is based on their internal conflicts, rather than your own alignment. And this is where your discipline becomes even more refined. Because it is not just about maintaining your focus on your own growth. It is about recognizing what is not yours to carry, what is not yours to resolve, what is not yours to engage with. And this clarity is what allows you to remain steady even as the environment around you becomes more unstable. Because you understand that your role is not to fix the fractures that have been exposed, but to continue moving in a way that reflects your alignment. And this is what ultimately allows you to move beyond the chaos without being affected by it. Because while others are navigating the consequences of their internal conflicts, you are continuing to operate from a place that is not influenced by those conflicts. And this is what creates that sense of separation. Not as distance in a negative sense, but as elevation in awareness. Because you are no longer operating within the same dynamics. You are no longer influenced by the same pressures. You are no longer engaged in the same cycles of comparison and reaction. And this is what allows you to maintain your clarity even as others lose theirs. Because your movement is not dependent on their stability. It is rooted in your own alignment. And as this continues, you will find that the conflicts around you, while noticeable, do not have the power to disrupt your path. Because you are no longer connected to them in the same way. You are observing rather than participating. You are aware rather than reactive. And this awareness is what protects your alignment, what allows you to continue evolving without being pulled back into dynamics that do not serve your growth. And this is where the true strength of your position becomes evident. Not in how you respond to the chaos, but in how you remain unaffected by it. Because you understand that what is unfolding around you is not a reflection of your actions, but a reflection of what your alignment has revealed. And that understanding is what allows you to continue moving forward with clarity, with consistency, with a sense of direction that is not influenced by the instability around you. Because you are no longer navigating within their framework, you are moving within your own. And that is what makes all the difference. And as all of this continues to unfold around you, as the comparisons intensify, as the tensions between them begin to surface more openly, there is a deeper shift taking place that you may not immediately recognize. Because while they are still trying to understand, still trying to compete, still trying to position themselves in relation to you, something has already changed in the structure of how you are being perceived. Something that goes beyond reaction and enters the realm of recognition. Because without you announcing it, without you declaring it, without you even intending it, you have quietly become a standard, a reference point that others are now measuring themselves against. And this is where the dynamic transforms completely. Because being observed is one thing, being compared is another. But becoming the standard is something entirely different. Because a standard does not need to speak. It does not need to explain. It simply exists, and, through its consistency, shapes what is considered normal, what is considered possible, what is considered acceptable. And this is what your presence is now doing. Not through force, not through competition, but through the quiet, steady demonstration of what alignment looks like when it is sustained over time. And this is why the reactions around you have become more intense. Because standards create pressure. They raise expectations. They redefine baselines. And when someone is not ready to meet that new baseline, when they are not aligned with the level of consistency or clarity that the standard represents, it creates a sense of distance that is difficult to ignore. And this is where the discomfort deepens. Because now, it is no longer just about comparing themselves to you. It is about recognizing that the level you are operating on is becoming a point of reference that they cannot easily dismiss. Because it is consistent, it is visible, it is sustained. And this consistency is what gives it weight. Because anyone can have a moment. Anyone can achieve something once. But when something is repeated, when it becomes a pattern, when it becomes a way of operating rather than a temporary spike, it begins to redefine what is considered normal. And this is what your journey has done. It has moved from being an exception to becoming a reference. And this is where your awareness must expand even further. Because becoming a standard carries a different kind of responsibility. Not in the sense that you owe anything to anyone, but in the sense that your consistency now has a wider impact. Because people are not just observing your results, they are interpreting your behavior. They are analyzing your patterns. They are trying to extract meaning from the way you move. And this is where it becomes even more important for you to remain aligned. Because the more consistent you are, the more your actions will shape perception, not just of you, but of what is possible. And this is where the distinction between alignment and performance becomes critical. Because if you begin to perform, if you begin to adjust your actions based on how you are being perceived, you risk distorting the very thing that made you a standard in the first place. Because standards are not created through performance. They are created through authenticity, through consistency, through alignment that is not influenced by external observation. And this is why your focus must remain internal. Because the moment you shift your attention outward, the moment you begin to move in response to how others are interpreting you, you introduce inconsistency. And inconsistency weakens the clarity that defines a standard. And this is where many people lose their alignment, because they become aware of how they are being perceived and begin to adjust themselves to maintain that perception. But this is where your understanding must guide you, because you recognize that your strength does not come from maintaining an image. It comes from maintaining alignment. And alignment is what sustains your movement, what keeps your actions consistent, what allows you to continue evolving without becoming rigid or performative. And this is what preserves the integrity of your path. Because you are not trying to live up to a standard, you are simply continuing to be the standard through your alignment. And this is what allows your influence to remain natural, to remain unforced, to remain something that others can observe and interpret without you needing to explain it. And this is where the deeper impact begins to take shape. Because as people continue to measure themselves against you, as they continue to observe your consistency, some will begin to shift. Some will begin to reflect. Some will begin to recognize that what they are seeing is not something to compete with, but something to learn from. And this is where the dynamic begins to evolve again. Because while some may still react with tension, with comparison, with resistance, others may begin to see your presence as a point of clarity, as a demonstration of what alignment can create. And this is where your journey extends beyond your own path, because it begins to influence the direction of others, not through instruction, not through guidance, but through example. And this is what makes your role so powerful, because you are not telling people what to do, you are showing them what is possible. And this is far more impactful, because it allows them to arrive at their own realization, to connect the dots in their own way, to recognize the patterns without being forced to accept them. And this is what creates lasting change, because it is not imposed, it is discovered. And this is why your consistency matters so much, because it provides a stable reference point, something that does not fluctuate, something that does not depend on external validation, something that remains steady regardless of how it is perceived. And this steadiness is what allows others to see it clearly, to recognize it, to eventually understand it, even if they cannot fully articulate it. And this is where your awareness must remain grounded. Because while your influence may grow, your focus must remain the same, on your alignment, on your clarity, on your continued evolution. Because that is what sustains everything. That is what keeps your movement authentic. That is what ensures that you do not become distracted by the role you are playing in the perception of others. And as you continue to hold this position, you will find that the tension around you, while still present in some areas, begins to shift in others. Because the more consistent you are, the more stable your presence becomes. And stability, over time, replaces confusion. It replaces resistance. It replaces the need to constantly question or analyze. And this is where your position as a standard becomes fully established, not as something that needs to be recognized, but as something that is simply understood, something that exists without needing to be explained. And this is where your journey reaches a new level of clarity, because you are no longer just moving forward. You are defining what forward looks like, not through intention, but through alignment. And that is what ultimately sets you apart. And as this realization settles more deeply into your awareness, as you begin to understand that what is unfolding around you is not random, but a reflection of the alignment you have cultivated within yourself, another layer begins to reveal itself with even greater clarity. Because now, you are able to see the contrast not just in behavior, but in energy. Not just in actions, but in intention. And this is where the difference between your movement and theirs becomes unmistakable. Because while they are reacting, you are responding. While they are being pulled by emotion, you are guided by awareness. And this distinction is what creates the stability that defines your path. Because reaction is immediate. It is driven by impulse, by discomfort, by the need to resolve tension as quickly as possible. While response is deliberate, it is grounded. It is informed by clarity rather than urgency. And this is what allows you to remain steady, even as the environment around you becomes more volatile. Because you are not being influenced by the same forces that are driving their behavior. You are not being pulled into cycles of comparison, of projection, of emotional fluctuation. And this is what creates that sense of calm within your movement. A calm that is not passive but active. A calm that comes from understanding rather than avoidance. And this is what makes your presence so powerful. Because it is not just about what you do, it is about how you do it. The way you remain composed, the way you maintain your focus, the way you continue to move forward without being disrupted by the chaos that is forming around you. And this is where the true meaning of alignment becomes clear. Because alignment is not about everything being easy or smooth. It is about remaining connected to your direction, regardless of the conditions. It is about maintaining your clarity, even when others are losing theirs. And this is what allows you to navigate situations that would normally create distraction or hesitation, with a level of ease that feels almost effortless from the outside. And this is where the misunderstanding often arises, because people tend to interpret this steadiness as indifference, as detachment in a negative sense, as a lack of awareness of what is happening around you. But in reality, it is the opposite. It is a deeper level of awareness, a recognition of what is happening without being consumed by it. A choice to remain aligned rather than reactive. And this is what creates that gap between you and them. Not as a form of separation, but as a difference in how energy is being processed. Because while they are allowing external dynamics to dictate their internal state, you are allowing your internal alignment to guide your external movement. And this is what gives you control. Not control in the sense of forcing outcomes, but control in the sense of maintaining your direction regardless of what unfolds. And this is what ultimately protects your path, because it prevents you from being pulled into dynamics that do not serve your growth. It allows you to observe without engaging, to understand without reacting. And this is what keeps your movement consistent. Because consistency is not just about repeating actions. It is about maintaining alignment across different situations, across different conditions, across different levels of external pressure. And this is where your growth becomes undeniable. Because it is no longer situational. It is integrated. It is part of how you operate, part of how you process, part of how you respond. And this integration is what allows you to move with a level of confidence that is not dependent on outcomes. Because your confidence is rooted in your ability to remain aligned, not in the results that alignment produces. And this is what makes your movement sustainable. Because it is not tied to success or failure. It is tied to consistency and awareness. And this is what allows you to continue evolving without being destabilized by external reactions. Because you are no longer seeking validation. You are no longer measuring your progress against others. You are simply continuing to move in a way that reflects your understanding. And this is what creates that sense of freedom that others may find difficult to grasp. Because it is not based on external circumstances. It is based on internal clarity. And this clarity is what allows you to remain unbothered in the face of dynamics that would normally create tension. Because you understand that what is happening around you is not something you need to resolve. It is something you need to remain aware of without being influenced by it. And this is what allows you to maintain your position, to continue moving forward without interruption. Because you are not reacting to the chaos. You are moving through it with clarity. And this is what ultimately defines your path. Not the absence of challenges, not the absence of external reactions, but your ability to remain aligned within them. And as you continue to hold this position, you will find that the contrast between your movement and theirs becomes even more pronounced. Because while they may continue to react, to project, to engage in cycles that create instability, you will continue to move with a level of consistency that reinforces your alignment. And this reinforcement is what strengthens your path, what deepens your awareness, what allows you to continue evolving without being pulled back into patterns that no longer belong to you. And this is where your journey reaches a level of clarity that cannot be shaken by external dynamics. Because you are no longer influenced by how others respond. You are guided by how you remain aligned. And that is what allows you to continue moving forward with confidence, with stability, with a sense of direction that is not dependent on what is happening around you, but on what is happening within you. And this is what ultimately sets you apart. Not the reactions you receive, not the perceptions you create, but the way you remain grounded in your alignment, regardless of everything else. And as you reach this point in your journey, as everything that once felt confusing now begins to reveal its structure, its meaning, its purpose, there is one final layer of understanding that becomes essential for you to fully step into the position you have grown into. Because while everything around you may continue to shift, while reactions may still arise, while comparisons and tensions may still exist in the background, the most important factor is no longer what is happening externally. It is how you choose to hold yourself internally. Because this is where your path is either protected or disrupted. And this is where your discipline becomes something deeper than consistency in action. It becomes consistency in awareness, consistency in emotional control, consistency in how you respond to the environment without being absorbed by it. And this is where the concept of remaining unbothered takes on a much deeper meaning than simply ignoring what is happening. Because being unbothered is not about avoidance. It is not about pretending not to see or feel what is unfolding around you. It is about seeing it clearly, understanding it fully, and choosing not to let it influence your alignment. And this choice is what defines your strength in this phase. Because the more visible the reactions become, the more tempting it can be to engage, to respond, to correct, to defend, to step into the dynamic that others have created around you. And this is where many lose their position, because they allow external energy to dictate their internal state. They allow reaction to replace awareness. And in doing so, they step back into the very patterns they have worked to move beyond. And this is why your awareness must remain sharp. Because you understand that not every situation requires your involvement. Not every reaction deserves your attention. And more importantly, not every dynamic is yours to participate in. And this is where your power lies, in your ability to choose where your energy goes. In your ability to remain centered, even when the environment is not. And this is what allows you to maintain your alignment without interruption. Because you are not being pulled in multiple directions by external forces, you are grounded in your own clarity, your own understanding, your own sense of direction. And this grounding is what creates stability, not just in your actions, but in your presence. Because when you are aligned internally, it reflects externally in the way you move, in the way you speak, in the way you respond. And this reflection is what reinforces your position, not through force, but through consistency. Because people begin to see that no matter what happens around you, your movement does not change. Your focus does not shift. Your direction does not waver. And this consistency is what ultimately dissolves the power of external reactions. Because reactions thrive on engagement. They feed on response. They gain momentum when they are acknowledged and amplified. But when they are met with stability, when they are met with clarity, when they are met with a presence that does not react but remains aligned, they lose their influence. They lose their ability to disrupt. And this is where your role becomes even more refined. Because you are no longer just maintaining your path. You are demonstrating a level of emotional discipline that others may not yet understand. Because while they are still navigating cycles of reaction, you are operating from a place of choice. And this choice is what allows you to remain unaffected by dynamics that would normally create tension. Because you understand that your energy is not something to be spent on every situation. It is something to be directed with intention. And this intention is what keeps your movement aligned, what ensures that your actions continue to reflect your awareness rather than your environment. And this is what ultimately allows you to rise above the entire dynamic, not in a way that creates separation, but in a way that reflects your growth. Because you are no longer operating within the same framework. You are no longer influenced by the same triggers. You are no longer engaged in the same cycles. And this is what creates that sense of elevation. Not as a position of superiority, but as a reflection of alignment. Because you have moved beyond the need to react, beyond the need to compete, beyond the need to prove. And this is what gives you a level of freedom that cannot be taken from you. Because it is not dependent on external conditions. It is rooted in your own understanding, your own awareness, your own ability to remain aligned regardless of what unfolds around you. And as you continue to hold this position, you will find that the dynamics that once seemed intense, that once seemed significant, begin to lose their weight. Not because they disappear, but because they no longer affect you in the same way. Because your focus has shifted. Your awareness has deepened. Your alignment has strengthened. And this is what allows you to continue moving forward without being slowed down by what is happening around you. Because you are no longer navigating based on reaction. You are navigating based on alignment. And that is what ultimately defines your path. Not the challenges you face, not the reactions you encounter, but the way you remain steady within them. The way you continue to move forward with clarity, with consistency, with a sense of direction that is not influenced by external noise. And this is where your journey reaches its highest level of refinement. Because you are no longer just growing. You are sustaining that growth. You are maintaining that alignment. You are embodying a way of being that is not easily disrupted. And this is what allows you to continue evolving without losing your foundation. Because your foundation is no longer built on external validation, it is built on internal clarity. And that clarity is what carries you forward, what keeps you grounded, what allows you to remain unbothered in the truest sense. Not because nothing is happening, but because nothing that is happening has the power to take you out of alignment. And that is what makes all the difference. And as everything comes full circle, as the noise, the tension, the comparisons, and the conflicts begin to reveal their true nature, what becomes clear is that none of it was ever meant to pull you off your path. It was meant to confirm it. Because every reaction, every projection, every moment of discomfort that others expressed in response to your growth was never about stopping you. It was about revealing the level you have stepped into. And this is where your understanding deepens into something unshakable. Because you begin to see that your journey was never about competing, never about proving, never about being ahead of anyone else. It was about alignment, about consistency, about becoming so grounded in your own awareness that external dynamics lose their ability to influence your direction. And this is what ultimately separates you from the cycle others remain in. Because while they are still reacting to what they see, you are responding to what you know. While they are still measuring themselves against you, you have moved beyond measurement entirely. And this is where your freedom becomes undeniable. Because you are no longer tied to perception, no longer influenced by comparison, no longer distracted by conflict. And as you continue forward with this clarity, you will find that the very things that once seemed intense begin to feel distant, not because they disappear, but because they no longer hold your attention. They no longer define your movement. And this is where your power truly reveals itself. Not in how others react to you, but in how you remain aligned regardless of those reactions. Because alignment is what sustains your growth, what protects your direction, what allows you to continue evolving without being pulled back into patterns that no longer belong to you. And as you fully step into this understanding, you will realize that everything that happened around you was simply part of the process, a reflection of the shift you made within yourself. And that shift is what changed everything.